vous toutes et tous.
Welcome to everyone. I now call this meeting to order.
La séance est ouverte.
The meeting has begun. Welcome to meeting number 16 of the Standing Subcommittee on International Human Rights, of the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs and International Development of the House of Commons. Pursuant to Standing Order 1082 and the motion passed by the subcommittee on Monday, January 26, 2026, the subcommittee will meet as part of its study on the global impacts of transnational repression. Today's meeting is being held in a hybrid format in accordance with the rules of procedure. Members may participate in person or via the Zoom application.
I'd like to make a few comments for the benefit of the witnesses and members. Please wait until I recognize you by name before speaking. For those participating by video conference, click on the microphone icon to activate your mic, and please mute yourself when you are not speaking. For those on Zoom, at the bottom of your screen, you can select the appropriate channel for interpretation, floor, English or French. For those in the room, you can use the earpiece and select the desired channel. A reminder that all comments should be addressed through the chair. J'aimerais maintenant souhaiter.
I would now like to welcome our first witness.
Madame Dr. Maria Chang.
Ms. Maria Chang, Senior Fellow.
Madame Grace Wallensack, National Coordinator for Falun Data Association of Canada. As individual, we have Madame Zaha Hassan, Senior Fellow, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. She is with us by video conference. Marcos Kolga, Mr. Kolga, Senior Fellow, MacDonald Laurier Institute. Mr. Peter Matisse, President of the Gemstone Foundation. He is here by video conference. From Canada Taipei Committee, we have Sherab Chershen, Executive Director. And from World Uyghur Congress, we have Zumretje Arkin, Vice President. Welcome to you all, and every one of you, he will have 5 minutes to give his remarks. And I would like to start with Madame Dr. Maria Chang. You have the floor for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chair, honorable members, thank you for this opportunity. The CCP's transnational repression against Falun Gong is a sustained global campaign, not isolated incidents. What is happening on Canadian soil is a direct encroachment on sovereignty, democratic values, and fundamental freedoms. Falun Gong is a spiritual practice centered on the principles of truth, compassion, and forbearance, practiced in over 100 countries. In 1999, the CCP launched a systematic campaign to eradicate it due to its popularity and independence, resulting in mass atrocity. For 27 years, the CCP has deployed a full spectrum of transnational repression against the Falun Gong community worldwide, including disinformation, surveillance, intimidation, harassment, assault, political manipulation, pressure on groups and institutions that work with the community, cyber attacks, and threats to family members in China. A defected high-level Chinese diplomat testified that persecuting Falun Gong is a formalized daily task for Chinese diplomatic missions worldwide. Central to this campaign is disinformation. As Falun Gong is unfamiliar to many in the West, The CCP has exploited this gap by systematically spreading a hate narrative across all available channels in Canada and globally. Canadian tribunals have ruled such content abusive and hate inciting and have recognized Falun Gong as a protected creed. Despite this, CCP diplomatic missions and proxies continue to spread propaganda and disinformation. The CCP's 50-cent army amplifies this disinformation across Chinese and non-Chinese social media platforms. Recent reports found thousands of fake social media accounts spreading anti-Falun Gong content, likely aligned with China. Prolonged disinformation has fostered indifference, eroded public support, and undermined Canada's ability to respond to serious human rights abuses in China and the repression occurring here on Canadian soil.
Two leaked CCP documents reveal Xi Jinping directly ordered a new coordinated campaign, one that has escalated sharply over the past 2 years, combining disinformation, lawfare, and the hoax bomb threat targeting Shenyun and Falun Gong. In Canada alone, 20 hoax bomb and shooting threats in 2 years, among over 270 violent threats worldwide. This year, targets expanded to Canadian leaders, including a threat stating, if Shenyun dares to perform in March, something bad will happen to both Justin Trudeau and Mark Carney, and there will be a massive explosion on Parliament Hill. Police deemed this threat non-credible, yet 6 performances at the Toronto's Fall Season Theatre Centre were cancelled. The perpetrator then boasted in Chinese emails, "The Toronto Fall Season incident was my most successful one. Canada is hardly worth taking seriously." The sender referred to the CCP as my motherland's Communist Party, and the email's timestamps correspond to China's Standard Time. The Vancouver Police Cybercrime Unit has determined that the phone number associated with the sender is based in China. The sender went further to impersonate our organization to send bomb threats to targets internationally, including the White House and the Tokyo Theater. We urge our government to take the following actions. 1, publicly condemn this campaign and convey through diplomatic channels that the CCP directed interference against the Canadians and institutions must stop. 2, direct the security agencies to investigate this threat as foreign interference, pursue perpetrators, and train frontline police to recognize transnational repression. 3, bring Bill C-70's counter foreign interference provisions into force without delay, and enact dedicated legislation explicitly criminalizing transnational repression as a distinct offense. 4, brief performing arts venue on responding to foreign-linked hoax threats. Where law enforcement finds no credible threat, Canadians' right to attend a lawful performance must be upheld. No foreign actor should veto cultural life in Canada. Thank you.
And now I would like to invite Madame Zaha Hassan to take the floor for 5 minutes. The floor is yours.
Thank you to the subcommittee for the invitation to offer testimony. In addition to being a senior fellow at the Carnegie Endowment in Washington, D.C., I'm also the co-editor of Suppressing Dissent, Shrinking Civic Space, Transnational Repression in Palestine, Israel. The main point I want to make today in my opening remarks is that our traditional understanding of TNR is insufficient to capture the full extent of the problem and how it functions in liberal democracies. The widely accepted definition is that TNR encompasses actions of a foreign government, typically an authoritarian adversary of the target country, to silence or harm exiles or others critical of the regime with the goal of chilling dissent. However, this definition overlooks TNR perpetrated by states considered allies or liberal democracies. The aim of TNR in such cases is to discourage or punish activism that could lead to policy change towards the TNR perpetrating state. Coordinated efforts by the Israeli government to suppress dissent in North America and Europe is illustrative of this brand of TNR. Efforts to suppress dissent advocating for a rights-respecting foreign policy towards Israel-Palestine began after the Gaza War in 2008-2009. But it was not until 2015 that the Israeli government mandated its Ministry of Strategic Affairs to combat international civil society efforts. The international grassroots pro-Palestinian rights movement was modeled after the campaign against apartheid in South Africa. Consumer boycotts, divestment and sanctions, or BDS, were the tactics advocated, similar to the tactics deployed by American civil rights activists in the 1960s. The Israeli military's objective was to create costs for this activism. Over the next decade, the ministry and its various successor ministries worked in coordination or partnership with pro-Israel organizations and individuals around the world, even hosting conferences for them. According to a 2017 annual report, the ministry intended to build the infrastructure for an organized network. 3 professional networks were established by the ministry: the Global Coalition for Israel, the Legal Network Initiative, and the Digital Network. Most of the work and identities of the members of these networks were classified by Israel. However, through open source material, Freedom of Information Act requests, and research conducted by Dr. Yusuf Munayir and other experts for the book Suppressing Dissent, we can understand how Israel and its networks coordinated their efforts to silence and intimidate speech and protest. Some of the very early accomplishments the MSA, the Ministry of Strategic Affairs, took credit for in 2019 included adoption of anti-boycott laws in 27 U.S. states by Congress and the UK government, the filing of 50 lawsuits against activists and their organizations around the world, the crackdown on campus activists, and the growing adoption of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, or IHRA definition for anti-Semitism. How did these networks do this? The ministry's so-called Global Coalition for Israel campaigned for the widespread adoption of IHRA's expansive definition of anti-Semitism that equated legitimate criticism of Israeli policies or critique of political Zionism with hate speech. As a lawyer involved with the Legal Network for Israel stated, quote, "If we permit administrators on university campuses, representatives on Capitol Hill, and the public to perceive the situation as merely a political disagreement, then we neuter the most important weapons in our arsenal. The weapons she was referring to is the use of anti-discrimination legislation offensively against activists. The result has been far-reaching, including cancellation of certain college courses, repression against pro-Palestinian campus protesters, doxing, arrests, deportation, and physical attacks against students. Members of the ministry's Legal Network for Israel worked to mire pro-Palestinian rights organizations in civil lawsuits and administrative actions claiming that their advocacy supports terrorism or incites against Jews. Individuals and organizations are also facing reputational harm resulting in loss of employment or opportunities and threats of losing nonprofit status or funding cuts. Members, of the Digital Network and the Israeli Cyber Unit have worked to pressure media companies to take down posts on the human rights situation in Palestine with great success during the war in Gaza in 2021. Over 90% of the requests for takedowns were honored. Today, content moderation policies have been adopted that treat certain pro-Palestine advocacy as hate speech or terrorism. Beyond these real-world harms to individuals and institutions, these activities suppressed robust debate essential for policymaking, weaken democracies, and undermine civil liberties. Thank you.
Thank you. Time was well respected. Thank you. And now I would like to invite Mr. Marcos Kolga to take the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, members of the committee, and my fellow witnesses. I have fond memories of working with this committee more than a decade ago when it played a key role in advancing Canada's Magnitsky Law, a campaign that I had the honor of leading with Bill Browder and my dear friend Irwin Kotler. But that work, along with my efforts to expose foreign authoritarian influence and information operations and transnational repression, has also made me a target of them. I am one of only 3 Canadians sanctioned both by China and Russia. The threats, intimidation, and harassment against me intensified when I led the civil society campaign for Magnitsky sanctions, and after I published the first major Canadian report on Russian influence operations in Canada for the Macdonald-Laurier Institute, titled Stemming the Virus, which I have provided to the clerk. That report exposed Russian information and cognitive warfare targeting Canada. It also outlined how the Kremlin arbitrarily accuses critics of being fascists or tolerant of Nazis in order to discredit, dehumanize, and silence them. Ukraine's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, has been labeled this way, as have prominent Canadian MPs, including former Deputy Prime Minister Chrystia Freeland, MP James Bazan, and former MP Boris Wisniewski. Shortly after my report was published, an article appeared in an Ottawa newspaper falsely accusing me of the same. After I exposed the role of a former Canadian ambassador to Russia as a board member of a Russian resource company, and Canadian academics who collaborate with Vladimir Putin's Valdai Club think tank and their role in advancing Kremlin-aligned positions within Canada's information environment, I became the target of a coordinated defamation campaign intended to have me removed from the Macdonald-Laurier Institute and to discredit my work. For their courage to stand by me, the Macdonald-Laurier Institute was among the first organizations outside of Russia to be officially designated undesirable by the Kremlin, effectively criminalizing content with the Institute or its members. Shortly thereafter, Russia's most widely read daily tabloid, Komsomolskaya Pravda, accused me of falsifying Russian history and attacked my Estonian heritage using Russian neo-colonial tropes designed to incite hatred. And this was followed by a long series of harassing emails and social media messages, many of which included death threats and threats against my family. I have submitted samples of these to the clerk. These threats caused sustained psychological stress for me and my family, and their effects continue to linger to this day. Now, finding help within Canadian law enforcement was extremely difficult. My local police service told me to contact the RCMP. The RCMP told me to go back to the local police. I was then told to contact CSIS. No one provided much help. I was left in limbo, isolated, and alone. Now, isolation deepens the fear and psychological stress victims are already enduring. And I'm deeply grateful to John Kushandish of York Regional Police, whose team took up my case. York Regional Police's approach is now being recognized internationally as an effective victim-centered model for responding to transnational repression. While that helped end the worst of those attacks against me, the pressure continues in other forms. In 2022, shortly after I published an opinion piece about Russian oligarch and close associate of Vladimir Putin, Roman Abramovich, I was informed by the publisher, Maclean's Magazine, that they'd received a legal threat from lawyers connected to Chelsea Football Club, which was then still owned by Abramovich. He was seeking the removal of the piece. Now, fearing costly legal action from one of the richest Russian oligarchs, the publisher backed down. I am also regularly warned by digital service providers that foreign governments are constantly seeking to hack my accounts and devices. But my reaction has been to fight back and to support others, those far more courageous than me and for whom the stakes are much higher, including the brave Belarusian, Ukrainian, Russian, Iranian, Jewish, Hong Kong, Uyghur, Falun Gong, and Tibetan activists like my friend Sherp Thurchin, who continues to be surveilled, intimidated, and threatened for exercising rights that should be protected in any democracy. Canada must treat transnational repression as a national security threat. That means ending the impunity through which foreign authoritarians and their domestic allies and enablers operate. We need clearer reporting pathways, better coordination among police, intelligence, and government agencies, and stronger victim-centered responses so that no one in Canada is left isolated when targeted by a foreign regime. I've also submitted to the clerk frameworks that I have helped develop for Digital Public Square and the Atlantic Council, which I hope will be useful to the committee in this study. I thank the committee, but especially my fellow witnesses for their courage and their bravery. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. And now I'd like to invite Mr. Peter Matisse to take the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and to the members of the committee for inviting me to testify. Many Canadians already have testified about the dangers and realities of transnational repression, including that perpetrated by the Chinese Communist Party. Therefore, I'd like to focus my remarks on the party's infrastructure for transnational repression and political influence. The party's main instrument is the United Front policy system. It works from the Politburo Standing Committee down to local party committees. In every kind of organization that you can find a party committee, you are likely to find a United Front work department. So this could be in a business, it could be in a research institution. This is not something that you can simply say the United Front work department is doing this, because there's a central level, provincial levels, and all the way on down. United Front work is a CCP tool for political struggle and conflict that U.S. intelligence once described as a technique for controlling, mobilizing, and using non-communist masses. The purpose of this system was to mobilize friends to isolate or strike at enemies of the party. In the 1930s, Mao Zedong was explicit about this, describing the party as a warrior that wields the twin weapons of United Front and armed struggle to storm and shatter the enemy. The United Front system builds bridges between the party and society through creating or co-opting or controlling social groups that can be leveraged for the party's political purposes. The closest we have in a democratic political context is like having a political campaign organization that never stops running, even after elections. Moreover, that same organization has to keep extending itself into schools, into media, into community organizations in a never-ending process to identify threats and to ensure the control of ideas that might be dangerous to the party. While Mao's perspective may seem historic rather than contemporary, Mao's basic framing of United Front work within the party's toolbox has been consistent and clear across all of his successors up to Xi Jinping today, all of whom have characterized United Front work as a magic weapon or talisman to facilitate China's rise in the midst of an international and ideological battleground. United Front work is not equivalent to influence operations or covert actions our governments might understand them. Those are set-piece operations with a specific goal, whereas this is something that is characterized as the day-to-day work of the party. So it's not only a party system with the committees, but it's present in almost every single government ministry, the Ministry of Education, the Ministry of Commerce, the Ministry of State Security, et cetera, et cetera. To do such work, the United Front system and those CCP cadre who participate in this target civil society organizations, wealthy proxies like Hong Kong tycoons, universities, companies, politicians and local governments, media organizations, and even sort of celebrity personalities, as well as any other institution that might shape interactions with the PRC. Not only can this organizational infrastructure be used to support transnational repression, including surveillance and intimidation, but it can also be used to support other harms, including trying to insert itself between democratic citizens and the governments and their representatives so that they speak with the party's voice, or that they hear their constituents, or see the legitimacy of their constituents represented by the party to them. Second is by constructing and influencing politicians, they undermine the integrity of decision-making. And finally, these groups can be used for facilitating intelligence operations and technology transfer. This is an all-purpose tool for creating and applying political power while hiding the party's hands. Even though some elements of the system are open to the public and are visible, the ultimate aim is still subversion and control. This is why all analysis and discussion of this should begin with the CCP and work outward, because we know what the party's intentions are, we know what the party organizations are, and we should be able to have a conversation about what it means to engage or to channel our engagement with China through organizations whose purpose is to break and shatter us. This is something where many of us may be naive rather than malicious, but that's the reason why we have to be able to have a conversation. We have to be able to understand how the party operates so that we can control this and that we can ensure the integrity of our democracies and our governments. Thank you very much for having me, and I look forward to your questions.
And now I would like to invite Mr. Sherab Chershen to take the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman and the committee members. I deeply appreciate this opportunity to speak with you today on the important matter of transnational repression. I'm one of the 20 Canadians sanctioned by the government of China on December 21st, 2024. While we wear this sanction as a badge of honor and as a recognition to our commitment to human rights and justice, it does come with real and lasting consequences. We have been deemed as a threat to China's national security, sovereignty, and development interests by the Chinese Foreign Ministry and almost all major Chinese state media. These sanctions are not merely symbolic. Since being sanctioned, our daily life has become more difficult, more fearful, and more restrictive. I receive frequent phishing emails. Our website has been infected with the malware. We have received threatening online comments from anonymous accounts. We have had to install VPNs on our phones and devices for basic security, but even that comes at a cost, slowing down other applications and constantly reminding us that we're living under threat. These are not abstract concerns. They affect how we work, how we communicate, and live. Our international travel has also become increasingly complicated. We have to think carefully about where we go, who we speak to, and what risk we may face in countries that are friendly to China. We have to watch our backs, be cautious with strangers, and remain constantly alert. At the same time, many of us carry deep concern for our loved ones inside Tibet or in countries with close ties to China, knowing that these sanctions can be weaponized at any moment. Despite our determination not to be deterred in our advocacy, this reality creates fear. It indirectly and subconsciously curtails our sense of freedom and at times even our courage to speak as openly as we otherwise would. The Canadian government has been supportive during this difficult time, extending solidarity, listening to our concern, holding consultation, providing safety workshop. We're grateful for that support. But the fact remains that being sanctioned by one of the world's most powerful authoritarian regimes, known for silencing dissent both inside and outside its borders, changes a person's life. Despite our best efforts to remain strong and continue our work, our lives have never been the same. We're constantly securing our digital tools, email, social media, websites, and living with a level of vigilance that no Canadian should have to accept. To understand the true meaning of being sanctioned by China, we must first recognize the broader threat posed by People's Republic of China. This is not simply about one government disagreeing with the criticism. It is about a state with a documented record of foreign interference, cyber aggression, transnational repression, and intimidation. The final report of the public inquiry into foreign interference found that PRC is the most active perpetrator of foreign interference targeting Canada's democratic institution. The recent report 2026 from Canada's National Cyber Threat Assessment also states that PRC poses the most sophisticated and active state cyber threat to Canada today. It notes that China conducts cyber operation against Canadian interests to advance political and commercial objectives, including espionage, intellectual property theft, malign influence, and transnational repression. China's blatant disregard for freedom of speech has gone beyond its own citizen. It has gone transnational now. The threat is already here in Canada. Canadians remember the arbitrary detention of Michael Kovrig and Michael Spavor for nearly 3 years. In a similar case, which many of we might have forgotten, in 2014, Canadians Kevin and Julia Garrett were detained after the arrest of Chinese national and Canadian permanent resident Sue Bean in Canada on charges related to the theft of sensitive U.S. military technology. Canadian citizen of Uyghur origin Hussein Salil has been imprisoned in China since 2006. China's own laws also help explain why these risks cannot be dismissed. Article 14 of China's National Intelligence Law clearly states that national intelligence institutions may require relevant organs, organizations, and citizens to provide necessary support, assistance, and operation. In other words, the obligation to assist the state's intelligence work is written directly into Chinese law. While we seek to diversify our trade and investment, we should not let the arbitrary arrests, arbitrary sanction of Canadian citizens be normalized. These incidents should not be treated as isolated events. We can continue to push for strengthened trade ties with the countries around the world, including China, while standing firm on international law, democratic values, without fear of retaliation and transnational repression. We must also, while we pursue trade building, we must build a solid guardrails, as mentioned by the government in last year, including transparency in the supply chain linked to China, an unrestricted and independent fact-finding mission to China, and reciprocal access to Tibet and East Turkestan. I'm adding reciprocal access here because the announcement of the visa-free access for Canadians to visit China, after the announcement, some of the Tibetan origin Canadian bought tickets and tried to visit Tibet and mainland China, but they were sent back to Canada without giving them any clear reasons. Thank you.
Thank you. And now I would like to invite Madame Zumrati Arkin to take the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Mr. Chair, honorable members, thank you for this opportunity. My name is Zumrati Arkin. I'm an Uyghur Canadian activist and Vice President of the World Uyghur Congress, an international organization defending Uyghur rights. For over 20 years, my organization has documented transnational repression targeting Uyghurs globally. Transnational repression is a growing phenomenon aimed at silencing human rights defenders, journalists, academics, and diaspora communities. And according to Freedom House, China is the leading perpetrator, using tactics such as online harassment, coercion by proxy, mobility controls, Interpol red notices, spyware, slap lawsuits, and abuse of extradition systems. One of the most cruel tactics is the family hostage policy, detaining or threatening relatives to silence activists abroad. And I want to highlight the case of Hussein Jalil, a Canadian citizen detained in Uzbekistan in 2006, deported to China under an Interpol red notice, despite Canada's objections. Nearly 20 years later, his fate remains unknown. His case reflects a systematic campaign that continues to affect people in Canada today. My own experience has demonstrated that the Chinese government uses these tactics everywhere. Since I joined the World Uyghur Congress in September 2019, my family and I have become visible targets. My relatives in Urumqi face ongoing harassment despite losing contact with me in 2017. And in 2024, I received anonymous messages with images suggesting my uncle was being interrogated. I have been followed in multiple countries, including on UN premises in Geneva, and filmed by individuals linked to Chinese entities. I have been targeted by online smear campaigns, deepfakes, and threats. And in 2024, my colleagues and I have received death threats during our General Assembly. Although I am a Canadian citizen, I do not feel safe anywhere. My father, also a Canadian citizen, was detained and interrogated in 2013 while visiting Urumqi and pressured to spy on Uyghur activists. When reported, no action was taken. Transnational repression does not only strike individuals, it is actually engineered to strike communities. It creates fear, anxiety, and self-censorship, forcing people to withdraw from public life and undermining collective advocacy. Tactics have evolved to avoid international attention, quietly intimidating individuals from speaking publicly, placing community figures under surveillance, and even enlisting community members to create positive images of China. Trust collapses from within, and communities begin to police themselves. Canada already knows this. Commissioner Marie-Josée Hogue described transnational repression as a genuine scourge in Canada and identified China as the most active perpetrator of foreign interference targeting Canada. Recent steps, including the appointment of a Foreign Influence Transparency Commissioner, are important, but these measures focus primarily on elections and political interference, not on the lived reality of diaspora communities facing daily threats. Canada still lacks a clear mechanism for victims to report transnational repression or receive support. Many are turned away because cases do not meet national security thresholds, leaving victims without protection and further traumatized. In light of this, we urge the subcommittee to take the following steps. First, expand the mandate of the Foreign Influence Transparency Commissioner to explicitly address transnational repression targeting diaspora communities. Second, legislate a clear definition of TNR and create specific offenses, ensuring accountability for those acting on behalf of foreign governments. Third, establish a safe, trusted, and accessible reporting mechanism separate from national security agencies where victims can come forward without fear. Fourth, train law enforcement and policymakers to recognize and respond to transnational repression and strengthen investigative capacity. Fifth, improve coordination across federal, provincial, and municipal levels to better protect affected communities. Sixth, develop legal and diplomatic tools and coordination with international partners to hold perpetrators accountable. And finally, to build long-term trust-based engagement with affected communities. Uyghur Canadians who are surveilled, threatened, and silenced are your constituents. This subcommittee has a critical opportunity to ensure that they are not left behind. Thank you, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you. I would like to move to first round of question and answer, and I invite Mr. Majumdar to take the floor for 7 minutes, please.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you all for your testimony today on transnational repression. It's certainly illuminating on many levels. In the interest of time, Peter Mattis, let me start with you. I want to give you an opportunity to respond to Senator Wenpa Wu, who described your recent Jamestown report as disinformation, fear-mongering, and bad fiction. You've warned of more than 575 organizations in Canada that are linked to the CCP's United Front Work Department. What do you make of a sitting Canadian senator refusing to take this threat seriously?
I think it's a kind of laziness not to look at the methodology and not to look at the party. And the point is, as I said in my testimony, we were not blaming Canadians for not understanding. We were saying that you should be able to look at the Chinese People's Political Consultative Conference, the Overseas Chinese Affairs Office in the United Front Work Department, and its supporting units like the Chinese Overseas Exchange Association, the Chinese Overseas Friendship Association, and all of the associated provincial organizations. These are not friendly organizations. They explicitly exist to do harm. And we actually should be able to have a conversation about what is the appropriate channel for engagement. What should we think of an organization whose leadership attends multiple World Chinese Media Forums in the PRC, right? This is about collaborating with the propaganda system, the United Front system, to influence foreign audiences about how to understand China, to tell China's story well. If people are Canadian citizens or American citizens or anything else who take official advisory or delegate positions with these United Front organizations, again, set of organizations that seek to do us harm, that seems to me a reasonable question that we could ask of our fellow citizens in a democratic state. And if we want to protect the integrity, we have to be able to have a conversation that deals with facts and deals with those sources. And our report left a clear methodology for examining and following up on those questions.
Thank you for that. Just as a follow-up then, you described alarmingly how the United Front Work Department is deploying a swarm approach, an asymmetric approach in democracies like ours, and indeed countries around the world. And it's a 24/7, you likened it to a 24/7 political campaign that never ends and constantly looks for opportunity. With Canada having the highest per capita density of United Front Work organizations that have been going after our own Uyghurs, Hong Kongers, Falun Dafa, among many others, in Canada, it's 5 times the size of the United States, the presence per capita. What unique risks does this create for our North American security, and what practical reforms do you recommend, not just for North America, but for the Western world?
First, I think that this kind of expansion in terms of it being open and being accessible is a product of a lack of direct pushback, right? If you go back to the controversial report Project Sidewinder in the 1990s, this was sort of a speculative effort. It was a sense that something could happen, right? And what you could see from a report like from the report done by Cheryl Yu earlier this year is that this is what happens when there is no pushback, when there are no investigations and there are no discussions about what takes place. And so many Canadian reporters have discussed about what has happened in Richmond and Vancouver, in Toronto, about the way in which the party and crime kind of come together. So the first thing is that you do have to make sure that sort of news organizations are equipped to research and look at this, because there are elements of this that only a news organization can report and could provide a credible discussion. The second is that you have to be building expertise inside companies, inside universities, inside politics, inside government, because how are you supposed to recognize that some obscure, let's say the Guangdong Overseas Exchange Association that's operating your district, like why should you know what that is a problem, right? You should be able to find some sort of resource. And this is the kind of thing that CSIS and RCMP should be able to do. And it also means that with the foreign influence registration system that's coming on, that you should be thinking about how do we enforce this? How do we create consequences? Because unless there are consequences, Beijing is running no risks whatsoever by continuing their operations.
Appreciate the testimony today. Thank you for that. Marcus Koga, it's nice to see you, my friend, former colleague at the Macdonald-Laurier Institute. And thank you for your courage, having borne witness to what you have endured for well over a decade in your advocacy for human rights. You and your family are truly courageous. Let me ask you about Bill C-219, which is a private member's bill introduced by James Bazan on confronting transnational repression in Canada. I had the honor of co-sponsoring it with him. How would that bill, in your mind, help improve the federal government's response and all the problems you've described to the threat of transnational repression?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for that very important question. I had the honor of leading the Magnitsky campaign back in, well, it started a while ago, around 2012, and concluding in 2018. And they did provide the first key tool in deterring transnational repression, holding the perpetrators to account. I don't think that we've used it to good enough effect to create that deterrence effect for those sanctions. But the other problem is that it is missing a few tools. And so what James Bazan's private members bill does, it adds very important amendments to our existing sanctions legislation. And it includes, as many of the witnesses here have asked for, a clear definition of transnational repression. And this is the first piece of Canadian legislation that has that very clear definition of transnational repression. It also adds, very importantly, visa bans for immediate family members of perpetrators, and it includes measures for far more robust enforcement of our sanctions legislation. But just allow me to quickly reiterate that transnational repression is not a partisan issue nor are the solutions to it partisan. The integrity of our democracy and defending the right of Canadians to express themselves free of threat, free of harassment and intimidation is not a trivial partisan issue. It affects all of us, including, as we very well know, those who sit in the House of Commons. So I actually urge all the members of this committee to go back to their caucuses and urge all of their fellow MPs to support James's Bill C-219 in order to hold those perpetrators to account.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Majumdar. And now I'd like to ask Mr. Zubairi to take the floor for 7 minutes, please.
I want to thank the witnesses for being here and for your courage and testimony. Just thank you for that. Continuing to be strong, remain strong, despite the challenges that you personally and those around you are facing. I want to start off with Maria and Grace. I know that you've been dealing with transnational repression over several decades. Have you seen an evolution in that, in the repression that you've been facing over the recent period in time, an evolution since you've been involved and active?
Yes, we've seen that over the 27 years. At the beginning, it was the Chinese consulates, the embassy, people taking anti-Falun Gong disinformation, hate propaganda to forums, to the public, and spread it. But over the last 15, 20 years, we see a lot more proxies in Canada that are doing the things for these consulates. And definitely, recently, the bomb threat is a very serious matter that is an international issue because Shenyun perform around the world, 200 cities every year. And nowadays, bomb threats become a reality or a daily reality. Whenever Shenyun goes, the bomb threats follow. And for Canada, if we cancel the shows without understanding foreign interference and transnational repression, that's a very dangerous sign. We bow to the communist regime so that they can silence us. So this is very important for Canada to stand up.
And so, definitely, the point you're mentioning, raising of how things have evolved over time, is important. Sharab, you mentioned about how technology is playing a role, and I'm assuming that's part of the evolution of repression that you have experienced or have seen manifest. Do you want to add to the question and see how? Expand upon the technological aspect as it relates to the repression that you've seen to the community?
Yes, sure. As I mentioned in my opening remark, some of the threats that came right after we were sanctioned were on Twitter accounts, and it called for assassination of us. And I took an immediate screenshot knowing that, because it was from a fake account, they might just delete it, which they did. And there's also an kind of unverified website called Canada Files, which has been compiling information on Tibetans, speaking out on human rights issues, labeling us as, foreign proxies, actually, which is very ironic. And our website, Tibet.ca, was down last year, just 3 days before March 10, which marks annual Tibetan Uprising Day. And it took us a long time, actually 2 months, to bring it back. Similarly,
so have you reported these incidents to authorities, Canadian authorities, and if so, what, if any, action has been taken around that?
We've informed to our contact person within the Global Affairs. Yes.
And how about the police or security agencies? Have you reported to them?
Reported in a sense that we received, I think, few rounds of safety workshop, so we did discuss those issues.
But in terms of addressing these threats or the targeting of your websites, et cetera, has there, to your knowledge, been any response or steps taken by authorities to investigate this or to prevent it into the future?
Not yet, no.
To your knowledge, and I understand the investigations oftentimes are not public, or even you might not be aware even if that is the case, but to your knowledge that isn't the case.
But the fact that there's an ongoing consultation workshop being provided, I take it as a continued study and assessment of the threat that we receive.
I understand. Zumratai, do you want to add anything to this question that I had with respect to the evolution of foreign repression interference?
Sure, thank you. I think there is a clear evolution because I think even 20 years ago, the transnational repression was exerted mostly on human rights defenders who were very vocal. However, in recent years, what we have observed is that this is now impacting the lives of normal Uyghurs around the world, those who are not even active politically or culturally, and it's almost in a way to prevent them from participating to public life. Even cultural circles are now have decreased. For example, we see in Germany, where I now reside, our cultural events, political events, we have seen how over the last 2-3 years, especially with the now free visa entries to China, people no longer attend. If we have protests, we used to gather at least 200 people. Now it's a miracle if we can get 30 people to join these protests. Even our cultural initiatives like language schools, dance schools, the participants are no longer willing to take the risk. And that's because the Chinese government has, in a way, become more sophisticated in its approach and more subtle as well. And there's a gray line.
In Europe, any, you said you're in Germany, in Europe, are there unique positive responses from European governments that we can learn from over here in Canada?
Yes, there are some governments in Europe that are taking this quite seriously. So, for example, in Germany, there have been some initiatives such as the creation of a TNR-focused desk, and together with the Interior Ministry, the Foreign Ministry, and the Interior Ministry are working together to host a hotline for victims of transnational repression. And this hotline is now open to victims. So that's a great initiative. And of course, civil society organizations is there, and they're working closely with civil society organizations. In Switzerland, for example, they've actually worked on a first report specifically on transnational repression targeting Uyghur and Tibetan communities in Switzerland last year. So this actually created a lot of awareness among different ministries. There were different consultations provided, and I actually just came from Belgium, where I met with the External European Action Services and the Belgian MFA, and they're also taking this quite seriously, and it's being also reiterated at the UN level.
Thank you, Mr. Zoubeiri. J'invite Monsieur Brunel-Duceppe de prendre la
I now
parole.
invite Mr. Brunel-Duceppe to take the floor for 7 minutes, please. Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all of our witnesses here with us today for this important study. Ms. Arkin, I've heard testimony. I'm very pleased that you're here today. We know each other well. We often hear testimony from members of the Uyghur diaspora that they're being targeted by repression and surveillance and threats. You spoke of the situation, and you're an example. Some countries seem to be taking this file of transnational repression very seriously. Is Canada taking this sufficiently seriously, in your opinion?
Je pense que les autorités
Thank you very much. I think that Canadian authorities take this issue seriously. Otherwise, we would not be here. However, existing mechanisms seem to be more to inform the public and to inform various authorities internally. Here at Parliament, MPs are doing extraordinary work to recognize this issue as one of a matter of national security, but it also affects the daily lives of activists and human rights advocates like us. However, there's no real action. We see now that we're talking about it more and more in, for example, committees like this one, in meetings at Parliament. But it remains on a basic level. So we need to act in order to facilitate the transfer of information and to open phone lines for victims. When victims call, the police, for instance, needs to know how to respond to those kinds of threats. Those threats are very serious because we live through those kinds of threats every day, and it has significant impacts, whether it be on a professional or personal level. There are workshops facilitated by authorities, but we need to do more, and Canada needs to work with its international partners. It needs to work on a multilateral level at the United Nations, in Geneva, in New York, in order to really take action. And I think measures proposed in Bill C-219 are very concrete. And I think they would really help us to fight transnational repression. Thank you very much. Yes, indeed, there's a great deal of willingness, but we're not necessarily seeing action. One of your recommendations was more training for police forces, also perhaps for people in the legal profession. How do you see that being applied in terms of the recommendation?
C'est très long.
On a legal level, it's a very slow process. For example, in Canada, in the Criminal Code, certain acts are included in the Criminal Code. However, surveilling family members in China or in Turkestan, that remains very difficult to get involved in. It's difficult to legislate. However, there's real willingness to define transnational repression. So I think we can start there. In Germany, there's a great deal of effort being made to do so. For instance, the Department of Foreign Affairs and other departments are involved. The Carney government is working more closely with the Chinese government. This diplomatic relationship can lead to having to manage very thorny files. There's the C-251 by the Bloc Québécois that focuses on this. Do you see a way of sending a message to Chinese authorities by saying that Canada is serious? That if we were to pass C-251 and put forward M-62, tabled by my friend, Mr. Zuberi, I think that when it comes to transnational repression, sending a more serious message would be in Canada's best interest.
Le projet de loi C-251.
Absolutely, Bill C-251 would help us. It has concrete measures, and we recently saw MPs in the House of Commons talk about blatant human rights violations, for example, forced work by Uyghurs. That happens among the Uyghurs, but it's omnipresent in China, in fact. We're talking about Michael Ma? Yes, whether it be Shenzhen or elsewhere, there's a system of forced labor, and the state supports it. It's not Chinese companies implementing it. It is, in fact, being implemented by the state. So I think that would be a real measure. And M-62 was one of the most successful measures so far. Mr. Zuberi here and other members worked a great deal on it, and I think we see the result. However, Uyghurs, who right now came through that program, well, they're still in danger. They get phone calls, they're constantly harassed, so work is not done. It has to continue. And we need support from Canadian authorities.
Okay, 40 seconds.
40 seconds? 40 minutes? No? I just want to continue along those lines because there's mention of electronic surveillance. If we were to counter forced labor, would some Chinese telecoms companies be allowed to enter Canada's market? Well, that's a very good question. I don't know. But I think that with this proposed bill, the burden of proof would be on the importer. It would be worthwhile for us to block those telecommunications products. As we've seen in the United States, there's a certain amount of controversy. Some products were not allowed to enter the market and was we're also trying to push for that, and we're also trying to push for that in the European Union. Of course, it's difficult, but it would be a good start.
J'invite Madame Vandenberg.
I now invite Ms. Vandenbeld to take the floor for 5 minutes.
And I just want to echo the thanks for all of you for the courage, for continuing to speak out despite the intimidation that you face. And, you know, I think I speak for all the committee members here that we are very grateful for your testimony, for your advocacy, and we are 100% supportive of the work you do. I'm very, very happy to see some of you back here at the with I think our committee has done a lot of work on these issues. I'd just like to start with Grace, with the Falun Dafa Association. If you could talk about, there's a word that you used, and I noticed others also use the exact same term. And I just wonder if you could delve a little bit more into that and then perhaps open it up. You said it's a coordinated campaign. And I think, you know, Mr. Kolga said the same thing, others. So when you say coordinated, I think that means different things to different people. But what exactly does that look like? And who is coordinating and how are they doing it?
Thank you for the question. I think that's important to understand how the Chinese communist regime works. The coordinator means that the order is from the very top, from Xi Jinping and also the high echelons of those leaders, from the public security ministry, from the state, the ministry, and so they have directives. And so that's like they instruct like worldwide, you know, all the countries working in the same way. So what we see, what happened to Falun Gong in Canada, that's also happening in other part of the country. So in the past couple of years, we see escalations sharply, you know, happened because Xi Jinping gave order in 2022, and he said that so far the global fight against Falun Gong was a failure, and so he initiated like a new campaign, and so like he instructed all the ministries to fight Falun Gong overseas, and they have a joint office in North America. They have a new office and to directly targeting Falun Gong, and so they have like a public opinion warfare and also legal warfare plus the bomb threat, and that happened globally in all the other countries. So that's and also with the social media, thousands of the accounts, you know, like spreading anti-Falun Gong or the CCP's narratives worldwide. You can see like they work together, and with this all happening like coordinately, and so like you see the bomb threat have follow the same pattern. The violation, the threat follow the same pattern. Even they use a different language. Like the threat is sent to Canada was in Swiss, in Czech, in French, like in Chinese, or like in all different languages, but the same person. You know, the ones who sent a threat to shut down the Four Seasons in Toronto, he sent the same threat to Vancouver, but Vancouver, they continue the performance. And he sent to other countries, like in France, in UK, in United States, and in Denmark. And so there's one threat sent to Canada to threaten the Prime Minister and also to all the senior leaders in the Parliament, that the same threat message sent to six head of state, like in Australia, like in Denmark, all those countries, they received exactly the same threat message at the same time, same day, from the same sender. So that's we see like this the pattern, and also the works it's by a state, cannot be individual or isolated incidents.
Thank you so much, and I think, you know, we see that this is happening globally. I would like to hear from Ms. Arkin and Mr. Turchin because it's a similar question, but you talked a lot about the surveillance, yourselves and others, and if we're seeing a coordinated global campaign, and we're seeing this level of surveillance, where is all of that surveillance data going, and what is happening to it? I'll start with Ms. Arkin, and then if we have time, Mr. Turchin.
Thank you for that question. All of that data is going back to Beijing at the highest level, as my colleague has said. And of course, the surveillance is both physical and also digital. So as I mentioned in my statement, I was surveilled on Yuan premises, and it's actually perpetrated by Chinese diplomats. And we did report this to the Yuan Reprisals Office, which of course they've taken note, but there's not much that that is being done at the UN level either. But I think now it's changing. But digitally as well, everything that goes online, or even all the information, the people that we communicate with, it is being surveilled, and also through relatives and through people from networks. So we have, for example, had issues in the last years where informants are infiltrating our communities, and sometimes they're Uyghurs, Tibetans, Hong Kongers, and we don't know that. So you can imagine that this sense of anxiety and fear that our community members have to live. Sometimes you don't know. Sometimes it's the closest people to you that actually are surveilling and actually infiltrating your networks.
Thank you, Madam Van den Bellen. Now I would like to invite Madam Tamara Kronis to take the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chair. And I really want to thank the witnesses for being here, especially since, given the sheer number of you that are under sanctions by various countries, the risk that you take in coming and exacerbating your relationships with those governments. So thank you. Traditionally, transnational repression involved a country targeting its own citizens living abroad. But increasingly what we're seeing foreign interference by those governments that is aimed at damaging, broader efforts that are aimed at damaging the institutions, public debates, and governments of the countries that are hosting human rights defenders, in order to increasingly make those environments just inhospitable for that kind of human rights action. So, Mr. Kolga, I just want to start with you. Can you just briefly comment on that intersection between transnational repression and foreign interference?
Sure. Thank you so much for the question. On the Russian side of things, this is nothing new. This has been going on for the past 100 years or so. Certainly after the Second World War, we saw Soviet Russia then target all critics of the regime then, and that was primarily those communities that were forced to flee, whether it's the Ukrainians, the Balts, the Poles, others. Anyone who was critical of Soviet Russia's colonial and neo-imperialist practices was often labeled as a fascist, as a neo-Nazi. So that means anyone, from those who fled, even children of those refugees, including myself. And using that term, what that was intended to do was to silence them, to discredit them, dehumanize them. And that's a tactic that's been just modernized over the past 20 years by the Russian government.
In the context of the Cold War, but we're less familiar with it in terms of China and the things that China is currently doing in that to sort of mimic some of those concepts that the Russians used to use in the context of Canada. And so I want to turn to Ms. Zumerte. You and three of you have personally, at least three of you, have personally been sanctioned by the Chinese government. When you hear claims that forced labor in China is merely hearsay, I'm wondering how this fits for you inside that framework of transnational repression and an attempt to make Canada less hospitable to human rights defenders of the practices that China is perpetrating. And I'm wondering how you respond to that based on your own experiences. And do you think that dismissing those concerns as hearsay really risks downplaying the credible evidence and discourages victims and witnesses and activists from being able to do the good work that they do?
Absolutely. I think that does downplay the severe abuses, and especially in a context where the Chinese government has consistently refused access to international experts, including UN experts. For the last UN Special Rapporteur who actually went and visited was in 2009, Frederick Novak, Special Rapporteur on Torture. Since then, no meaningful access was given, except for one Special Rapporteur last year on course of unilateral measures, who basically said that sanctioning China was bad for the economy and for the development in China overall, which was actually, we criticized this a lot. But no meaningful access was given even to the UN Human Rights High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, in 2022. So it does downplay a lot.
And Mr. Thurchin, in the context of the threats that you've faced, do you feel that the moves that we're making towards doing more business with China, in the context of the questions about electric vehicles that my colleague asked and some of the other activities that we're doing, do you think that that sends a signal to those regimes that their activities aimed at silencing voices around human rights are effective and that they should keep going? Like, what does this mean for you? And what does it mean for your personal safety?
Thank you. I think China has used trade into its advantages for a long time to coerce, anyone speaking on Tibetan and human rights issues. What we could learn lesson from is the U.S. had very engaged, interlinked trade relationship with China for decades. And now China has turned it around into its advantage. So we have to be very careful. I'm not saying that we shouldn't diversify trade and engage with China. But when we do, we have to establish very strong guardrails. And we must understand that this is a regime which could be very ruthless. It has, a colleague spoke about United Front Work, but what we haven't spoken is China has an intelligence wing called MSS, which has 3 times as more people than CIA. And it uses this MSS to, surveil on people. So am I in favor to engage in trade with China? Not really as a Tibetan Canadian, but I also understand Canada's need to diversify trade. So I would focus on establishing guardrails, which China would take it as really, I think, it's a step to challenge its coercion capability.
Thank you so much. And Mr. Kolga, do you have anything you'd like to add?
No, I would completely agree with that. I mean, we have to have an understanding that the Canadian government is trying to diversify trade, but at the same time, we should be also able to call out human rights abuses, and certainly to speak up for those 20 Canadians who have been placed on China's sanctions list. I didn't hear any mention of that. When the Prime Minister was in Beijing, and I know that a lot of us were concerned that our situation was not at all mentioned during that trip.
Merci. Thank you, Madame Cloners. J'invite Monsieur Brunet-Dessep à prendre la
I now invite Mr. Brunet-Dessep to take the floor for 5 minutes. Thank you. I am going to follow up on that, Mr. Kolga, because a few members of this committee are under Chinese sanctions, including me. So it seems we have something in common. Now, when it comes to diplomatic relationship with China warming up, do you think that diplomatic power is something that can be used to deal with sensitive or thorny issues? Canada is claiming to warm up its relationship with China, but do you not think the country is responsible for raising those issues when the opportunity is provided?
Question. I believe that we have diplomatic tools in place to hold the perpetrators of human rights abuses, especially mass human rights abuses, to account. I don't think that Canada, having those tools in place, we've used them quite effectively in terms of Russia's crimes against Ukraine, Russia's domestic repression inside of Russia, I think with the Belarusian regime as well, who is engaged in mass repression of the Belarusian people after 2020. We haven't been so effective in using them against Chinese regime perpetrators of mass human rights abuses. And I think this is the first tool that we have. We should be using it in order to demonstrate to the Chinese government that we will not stand for these sorts of abuses and that we stand with the victims. At the current rate, we have very few Chinese officials on that sanctions list, and this is the first tool. If we're talking about diplomatic tools, this is the first one that we should be using, and we should be using it to greater effect.
Tenant compte que le Parlement canadien en 2021.
I agree that in 2021, that Canada's Parliament recognized the Uyghur situation as a genocide. But it seems that we're less severe with China than we are with Russia. When it comes to the 11th Rinchen Lama that disappeared, that's quoted as or pointed to as a symbol of repression. How can that situation impact the Tibetan diaspora, especially when it comes to intimidation or even self-censorship? Obviously, the Dalai Lama will not be there forever, and so there's going to be an issue there for the next Dalai Lama. I'd like to hear what you have to say about that. Is there a relationship between transnational repression and how it can amplify elsewhere?
Thank you for the question. The detention of Panchen Lama at 6 years old has a direct connection with China's long-term plan to capture and really control Tibetan Buddhism through their influence in the succession of His Holiness the Dalai Lama. He's 90 years old, and China has already claimed that they would have the rights to appoint the next Dalai Lama. And Dalai Lama is an honorary Canadian citizen, and I have advocated in the past in different committees that Canadian soil shouldn't be used by Chinese government to spread disinformation about their claim on the religious rights of Tibetan people, including on Dalai Lama. In 2018, Chinese delegates claiming to be a representative of Tibetan Autonomous Region came and testified before the Foreign Affairs Committee on many issues, but also on Panchen Lama, where one of the witnesses said that Panchen Lama is doing fine and does not wish to be disturbed. But the world hasn't seen him or heard him for the last more than 30 years.
Oui, merci infiniment pour ça.
Thank you so much for that. We just talked about Canadian citizenship. Ms. Arkin, that leads me to the issue of Hussein Saloo. Could you perhaps talk about that particular case? It's a perfect example of transnational repression. Yes, absolutely. As I mentioned in my testimony, it's a perfect example. We are really disappointed because during the Prime Minister's visit, there was no confirmation that he mentioned that publicly in Beijing. I think it's a clear issue of transnational repression. We also see that both Michaels were freed. However, the same effort hasn't been made by authorities. That's exactly what I was getting at. The two Michaels are Canadian citizens. Mr. Salil is a Canadian citizen. He got his citizenship after he was born. Is there not a kind of second class of Canadian citizen because there's been not the same level for among Canadian diplomats currently? If we talk about the Michaels and Mr. Salil, who have the same rights under Canadian citizenship, and one of those people obtained their citizenship after they were born, whereas the others had their citizenship from birth, is there not a paradox? Yes, there is a paradox. I'm not saying that Canadian authorities haven't tried. However, more effort is required. There hasn't been a consular visit since he disappeared. It's a very basic recommendation, and we call on the government to do so and to mention his case every time there's a bilateral engagement with Beijing. The two Michaels, their case was highly publicized. That was not the case for Hussein Jalil, and his family is still waiting to hear from him here. It's been 20 years. I think there's more that Canada could do, and we could mobilize international partners in order to find out what's happened with him. I now invite Mr. Zubeda to take the floor for 5 minutes.
I'd like to start with Mr. Matas. Mr. Matas. You talked about, we heard testimony about how there's been an evolution of TNR. And with respect to that evolution, we heard that at one point it was officials and later on it moved into organizations. Do you want to comment on that at all based upon your experience and background? Where we are at today specifically?
There's been a steady
Please go ahead.
There's been a steady expansion of United Front work, where you might say in early phases it was about mobilizing diaspora. You could say that it was about targeting a few handful of individuals or controlling the back and forth. But it's increasingly become sort of an effort at mobilization. And therefore, you could see the groups being mobilized around Canadian politicians. You can see the groups being mobilized, for example, during COVID to sort of get access to PPE and facilitate its transfer, as happened in Quebec. There's all of these efforts to control. And when you think about something like Confucius Institutes on university campuses, I've never been convinced that this was so much an espionage threat or a propaganda threat, so much as that it trapped the university into a kind of relationship with the PRC that somebody who got promoted because they had built this relationship now has a stake in it and is sort of deeper and deeper inside the university's decision making. And they're considering sort of the interests that were created by the Confucius Institute, by this United Front system, in thinking about the choices for that university, even though the Chinese Communist Party considers academic freedom to be something that's fundamentally anathema to its values and to the way it thinks society should work.
How do we tread the line between, being aware of this and not falling into discrimination and into just something beyond awareness and appropriate responses? How do we tread that line, in your opinion?
So first, let's recognize, as some of the previous panelists just pointed out, that we are actually discriminating. We are treating people who have had, in some cases, criminal acts committed against them by a foreign government on our soil as secondary citizens that don't deserve the full faith and protection of our laws. So let's remember that piece of discrimination that's already ongoing and taking place. The second is that we have to have clear laws about what is right and what is wrong. And when it is illegal, that's where our intelligence and our police services have a responsibility to investigate and to disrupt and to ensure that that behavior is not tolerated and that there are direct consequences for it. As for the rest of it, right, part of being a citizen in a democracy is being able to have this conversation. And it means that it should be informed. Why isn't it appropriate if you are a member of the press or if you're a member of a university or if you are an elected politician? Why would you surround yourselves with people who choose to be official representatives, if you will, of not just of China, not just of the People's Republic, but of a part of the system that is actively hostile to us? We wouldn't sit here and say, oh, you're doing this with the Ministry of State Security. That's fine, right? That's an intelligence service. We would start thinking of this something like espionage. This United Front system is something altogether different. And it's not an intelligence service. It's not just a sort of people-to-people diplomacy organization. It is something that the party uses to build power, to mobilize when it needs to. And that is something where we should be asking, just like with FERS, like, is someone acting because they're a citizen, or are they acting at the direction of someone else or a foreign government?
In the 30 seconds or so it remains, I'll open it up to you to add anything in terms of recommendation or concluding thoughts.
I think this is one of those touchy issues where it works to help with concrete cases, that we should look at espionage cases and we should look at the organizations that are involved, because we've already decided that a conviction happened and that there was a danger. So what else happened around them? What other organizations were involved? And that can help us figure out a conversation about where are these Where are things that we have already decided were legal, already decided were bad? And how do we understand that environment that was created? Because that's our early warning point. Because these organizations, in some cases, are established around companies, around universities to facilitate this bad behavior. So it's worth watching and to see the pattern as it emerges.
Thank you, Mr. Zubairi. And now I would like to invite Mr. Davis to take the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Before I get into sort of a broad topic, I wanted to ask either Dr. Chung or Ms. Wolensack about Shen Yun. This is one of the most popular presentations you can see in North America. It's traveled across the continent for years. I believe it performed at the National Arts Centre here in Ottawa for 19 straight years, but it has been canceled. The evolution of the threats against the show, can you just walk me briefly through Canadians, it's hard to explain to Canadians what transnational oppression is and what these threats are, but this is a very salient and specific example of something that is happening right in front of our eyes. Can you explain how that evolved and what the status of the show is now?
Okay, thank you. Basically, I think this is another manifestation of the transnational repression and the foreign interference. I think another aspect of the coordinated campaign was the Chinese embassy and the consulate. They also very actively pressure the theaters and the government to cancel. We have dozens of such examples worldwide in the other countries. And so at the meantime, there's this public opinion campaign. So the government mobilized the disinformation campaign. It's spread all over the place, which is really false. But people have no idea what's going on. That's another factor. And then plus the bomb threat. I think that a lot of theaters, they have the concerns, and so that's the valid concern. So but then we ask our government to help, with a public statement to condemn those the bomb threat, because that's involved the cost, about the public safety, but actually they are false ones. They are not a real threat. So the people should not, take it as real, but to censor, lawful, legitimate culture performance here in Canada. So that will facilitate the Chinese Communist Party's goal. We should not fall into that trap. That will really embolden the CCP, the Chinese Communist Party, to go further, to do more of this if they see the success in Canada, and they could, apply this, it's become a playbook, to apply to the other countries and in other communities, other groups. So that's we see that's the dangerous precedents, happening in Canada. Now we see.
Thank you. I have limited time here, but Canadians are inundated with social media. We hear about forced labor, we hear about transnational suppression, we hear about persecution, human rights violations. Mr. Kolga, I wonder if you could give me your ideas on how China and Russia linked information operations adapting within Canada's media landscape, including digital platforms and community-based outlets. What are the indicators that we should be paying closer attention to?
Thank you very much for the question. I think that we need to be looking at the role of influencers. We have a very clear case of Russia allegedly using $10 million to hire U.S.-based influencers. This was done allegedly through 2 Canadians. It included a Canadian influencer as well. $10 million was used to set up a media platform in order to inject Kremlin-aligned narratives into the North American information space. Each of these influencers was offered $100,000 for a 1-hour podcast episode to do so. And so we have a clear smoking gun of the Russian government paying influencers to do this work. I think this just represents the tip of a much larger iceberg in terms of Russian and Chinese and Iranian information and influence operations targeting North America. And one other thing that I should also mention is that we shouldn't just be looking at Canada when it comes to these operations. Information influence operations, often they don't respect borders, they're transnational. And so a well-known influencer in the U.S., although they may be U.S.-based, they may be talking about primarily U.S.-based grievances, a lot of those grievances are also shared by many Canadians. And so those audiences in Canada are significant. So I think in terms of information influence operations, this is one of the aspects that we need to pay much, much closer attention to, because as these information operations evolve, our foreign adversaries understand that it is the domestic voices that lend credibility to them. Russian state media and, God forbid, Global Times in China, I don't think there's a single Canadian that are going to those sites. But the those domestic influencers that amplify those narratives, they are being listened to, they have significant audiences, and I think they represent a significant threat to our democracy and our information space.
Monsieur Brunel-Duceppe à prendre la parole pour 5 minutes.
Mr. Brunel-Duceppe, I invite you to take the floor for 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Ms. Arkin, have you already seen politicians be targeted because of their work? For example, for their work with human rights organizations or organizations like yours, Baibujin? Yes, many times. The representatives of IPAC, the Interparliamentary Alliance on China, of which you are part, they were approached by ambassadors in different countries, including North Macedonia, Indonesia, Malaysia, and I participated in missions to other countries, for example, Latin America and Southeast Asia, where politicians received messages before we visited, messages from the Chinese embassy. The Chinese embassy told them not to meet with us. That happens often. There are politicians who are very vocal about fundamental violations of Uyghurs' rights. Then they get a visit, and then they are silenced. If it doesn't work individually, they'll go talk to the leader of their party, or then they'll move up to the president of their parliament, and so on.
Mr.
Tershin, when you see Mr. Carney's trips where economic agreements are being signed with China, when you see that Liberal MPs are brought back from Taiwan to participate in Carney's trip, and when you see Michael Ma, who casts light on what's happening with forced labor, do you think that China's feeling less and less threatened, that it's feeling more comfortable using or even amplifying transnational repression through the diaspora, the virus diasporas?
I think China certainly has shown its aggression and ruthlessness in terms of both the report that came from Public Inquiry on Foreign Interference and the recent report from Cyber has found China as the main perpetrator of foreign interference. And that we saw in one of the recent election candidate basically saying that the other candidate should be handed over to the Chinese consulate for the bounty that was announced on him, which is absolutely unacceptable in a democratic, free, independent country like Canada. We cannot let China take advantage of Canadian freedom and democracy. China is really good at studying and extracting and exploiting the diversity, the democracy into its advantage. And we have to really recognize this. Thank you.
Kolga, vous avez mentionné le nom.
You mentioned Erwin Kotler. He was my mentor, but I think he mentored many other people who are here around the table. He also worked closely with Mr. Kotler. Is that not what he was subjected to, with threats to his life coming from a government of another country, specifically Iran? I was wondering if you could talk about that to the committee.
Thank you for the question. Absolutely. I believe that, this was not the first time that Professor Kotler has been targeted. I remember him telling me about a trip that he took to Russia in the early 2000s when he was advocating for human rights and had been doing so for several decades. When he visited Moscow in the early 2000s, he believes that he was poisoned by Russian intelligence services. So this is not the first time that he has faced these sorts of threats. He faces a regular bombardment of threats via email and otherwise. And all of this, of course, is related to his work in defending human rights and standing up for those most vulnerable to whether it's domestic repression inside of places like China, Russia, Belarus, and beyond, but also standing up for those of us who are fighting with him in common cause for those rights here in Canada or elsewhere. And I think that those sorts of threats that Professor Kotler is facing and has been facing, especially these latest death threats from Iran, this is only going to continue unless we take a stand, and this government takes a stand, and all of the members around this committee, along with their caucuses, take a stand against them to say enough is enough. We are going to stand up to transnational repression. We are going to support the disruption of these sorts of operations, and we are going to stand up for the rights of those who are being threatened and, again, most vulnerable to transnational repression. Until we take that sort of a stand, they're going to continue. I've seen this happen for the past 20 years. I have been a victim, but more importantly, as I mentioned in my opening remarks, I've been working with those very brave activists like Sherip, who's been doing this for just as long, but faces much more dire consequences. We need to stand up for them. We need to find that political will. And until, like I said, we do that, I think that our foreign adversaries, our authoritarian foreign adversaries, are going to continue targeting us with impunity, unfortunately.
Thank you. Now I'd like to invite Madame Van der Bellen for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you, and I'd like to continue with Mr. Kolga, and thank you for that. I think our committee has done very well in standing up for human rights defenders, and we will continue to do so, including all of you. I want to pick up on something you said in your opening remarks, because you used a term that I had not heard before. You spoke about cognitive warfare. And we had heard some of the others talk about the psychological impact of some of the surveillance and intimidation. But could you maybe, it sounds like this is a more scientific, this is not just, trying to intimidate people. There's something more behind it. So if you could maybe talk a little bit about that, and then maybe I could hear some lived experience from some of the others.
For that question. Cognitive warfare is a more specific term. It's not just information warfare. It's not just transnational oppression. This is warfare undertaken by our authoritarian adversaries to try and manipulate our understanding of the world around us, to impair our ability to clearly make political decisions based on facts. It's part of what I call cognitive sovereignty, our ability to defend our information, the sovereignty of our information spaces, and to defend collectively, not just individually, but collectively, our ability to make those political decisions clear of any sort of foreign intimidation. And with the topic that we're talking about today, clear of any fear, intimidation, harassment as well. When we look at the Uyghur, the Tibetan, the Falun Gong, Hong Kong communities, they are being bombarded with cognitive warfare, and we're seeing that on an increasingly large scale. And the sophistication with which it's carried out through is just in helping them intensify those operations. So that's what I mean by cognitive warfare, and also cognitive sovereignty, which is an important term when we're talking about these issues.
So I'd like to hear how this is impacting the other witnesses in your lives. Mr. Turchin, maybe if you could begin.
I think one of the biggest cognitive warfare that China has launched on Tibet issue for more than 60 years is that they have repeatedly created a narrative that Tibet is an issue of ethnic minority through a manufactured history. And the world, unfortunately, has bought into this narrative. And today, when people discuss about Tibet, it is almost assumed as an issue of human rights, which is very important, as an issue of ethnic minority. But if we go back to 1960s, even to 1970s, it was an issue of one nation invading another. So China has really succeeded in creating this, impression among the rest of the world that this is an issue of ethnic minority. So that, I think, was an example.
And Ms. Arkin with the Uyghurs, if you could give your experience.
I think it's also very similar, but also that Uyghurs have been labeled as terrorists and separatists for the longest time. And before, of course, 9/11, we were labeled as separatists. Nowadays, we're labeled as terrorists. So the moment that you engage in political advocacy, that's the label that you kind of carry with you. And of course, that has repercussions on your travels, for example. So you can be issued an Interpol Red Notice, for example. And then we know, for example, the case of Idris Hassan, who has sought refuge in Canada. He was detained in Morocco because he had over 2 years because he had an Interpol Red Notice. So these are kind of actions that also go along the line of cognitive warfare.
Yeah, the Falun Dafa, because you also talked about lawfare, which is similar to this. So if you could also, in the last minute remaining. Yeah.
The CCP used lawfare to make the world think that Shen Yun or Falun Gong have done something wrong. But actually, all these have been debunked by the Shen Yun Performing Arts and Falun Gong Info Center. However, the Chinese Communist Party has started in 1999. Once the persecution started, they used a cult narrative to describe Falun Gong, and that planted a seed for even general Canadians. When they do not understand Falun Gong, they would think that CCP was right. And now, when there is, say, political differences, then they would use that to attack Falun Gong. So that is a cognitive warfare that is very unfair to the Falun Gong community.
Thank you. Thank you, Madame Van den Ven. And now I would like to invite Madame Kronos to take the floor for 5 minutes, please.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chair, and really thank you to the witnesses. This has been a really interesting and important discussion that we've had here today. I want to turn back to the concept of cognitive warfare and misinformation and think about it in the context of both the goals that various would-be world powers have and the fora in which they are conducting the cognitive warfare that they're conducting in this country. And so I'll start with Mr. Kolga. What do you think the goals of Russia, China, Iran, the United States are with respect to Canada? How do they differ? And what role are university campuses playing in all of this? What role is, we talk a lot about the internet, but where is the warfare occurring? It's occurring in the courts, it's occurring on the internet, but where is it physically manifesting itself, and who is being targeted and why?
Very big question. I'll try to be as concise as possible. Look, on the Russian side, and I don't think it's that much different on the side of the Chinese government, we have certain elements of their playbook, which was exposed in a 2024 FBI affidavit focused on Russia's doppelganger operation. And so we have very sensitive, top secret, high-level documents that were leaked from the Russian presidential administration that basically lay out what those objectives are. And sort of at the top of that list, at least for the Russians, is to disparage the Ukrainians, to erode public support for the war in Ukraine, But more importantly, it is to divide democratic nations, to find the most potentially divisive, polarizing issues, and then to basically target both sides of those issues with various forms of misinformation and disinformation. And so from those same documents, we know that Russian strategic communications firms, also leadership within the government, was instructed to persistently monitor our information space for those sorts of issues. And they've been doing that for quite some time. And so I think that, we certainly saw this. We've seen Russian information operations target both sides of environmental issues. During Black Lives Now, they targeted both sides of that issue. During COVID, we know that they became extremely active in trying to intensify the social impacts and the political impacts of the pandemic on Western societies, including Canada. And right now, with my work with DisinfoWatch, we're sort of monitoring what's happening in the Canadian information space right now. And we're seeing Russia become very active in terms of trying to amplify regional grievances inside of Canada to try and further sort of flare up and polarize Canadians on those regional issues. So this is what Russia does very well. China is doing it increasingly well, but what China does very well is it focuses on
I apologize. It's just I only have a minute and a half left, and you're right. People can probably extrapolate in terms of what China is doing and which issues they are targeting both sides of, like things like the forced labor. On Iran, you can see where they're going. But the question that I want to ask, and this is the thing I want to get at for the people that are watching at home. As politicians, we get a lot of email. We get a lot of forum email.
I'll bet.
And my question is, and it'll probably be the last question of the day, it's what advice do you have to the people watching at home? When they get a report, they watch something online, there is inevitably a something where they want someone to click a petition and send us a message. What advice do you have for people when they are learning about issues that look to divide Canadians?
Take a step back, take a deep breath, think about what you're seeing, consider who's behind it and what they're trying to achieve before you click on anything. The other thing that I tell Canadians is stop looking at social media. Just get off social media if you can. Get a subscription. I know that there's the trust in professional journalism has been eroded over the past decade, 2 decades, intentionally so, I think, by some of our foreign actors. Get a subscription to a newspaper. Buy your children, especially, a subscription to a newspaper. But get off social media.
Or even better, not just one newspaper, but several newspapers.
Several newspapers, absolutely.
I personally try really hard to make sure that I'm looking at sources.
Yeah.
Sources that agree with me, and when I see a whole bunch of sources all taking the same position, I will actually go and try and find the counterpoint, if not just to understand what else is going on in the world. So thank you very much for that, because it is so important right now at a time when people don't, it's so hard to be able to tell when you're being spoon-fed something that, and being taken down a path of something that people want you to believe, and when you really are seeing data that should cause you to change your opinions.
Thank you, Ms. Cronus. J'invite M. Brunel-Duceppe pour 5 minutes.
I invite Mr. Brunel-Duceppe to take the floor for 5 minutes. Thank you, Mr. Chair. I just want to talk about the conversation that just happened, because I think organizations like the World Congress uses social media maybe because of a lack of traditional media coverage. I don't know who would like to talk about that. Ms. Arkin? I know that it's also used by human rights organizations, so perhaps that statement needs to be qualified a little. When it comes to politicians targeted by Beijing, who are subject to transnational repression because they defend minorities persecuted by certain regimes, but there's also police officers that have been targeted. You're based out of Munich. Have you seen how this plays out in different jurisdictions, in different countries. There's a lot of different political parties in Europe. It's not like here. Countries can have up to 10 political parties. Often, they are targeted by foreign governments in order to help them in their mission of repression. Do you have some examples to give about certain political parties? Or if you don't want to give an example, that's fine. But what are you seeing on the ground in Europe and here in Canada? Just to see if I've understood the question, if politicians are being used by Beijing to facilitate their mission of repression. I don't have any concrete examples, but I know that there are some political parties that are very close with the Chinese regime. AfD in Germany. But what's ironic is that sometimes they'll meet us. They want to meet us. We refuse, of course, but they want to meet with us, and we never know what the goal is. It's true that there are parties, sometimes in Germany and some other countries, there are leftist parties that are very close with the regime. It's true that it's very worrisome to see that. As human rights defenders, we don't know if they inform Chinese authorities of our meeting afterwards, and so we have to take precautions.
C'est un message à tous les politiciens
So, a message needs to be sent to all politicians to be careful of who we talk to, who we meet with. We have to be responsible when exercising our authority. Mr. Terchin, same question for you. Do you see Beijing sometimes trying through intermediaries, where it be politicians, in order to help them further their mission?
Yes, while there are few, there could be few politicians who are influenced by China, but I come with a mindset that vast majority of Canadian politicians are supportive of human rights. And when I come here, for example, today, when I come here and testify, I know that all committee members here are supportive of human rights. I come with a lot of confidence that regardless of whatever I say here, whether agreed or disagreed, but the committee members, MPs, would support my freedom of speech. So yes, I do acknowledge there are a few, politicians who are influenced by China.
Je vous pose la même question, Monsieur Kolga.
Same question for you, Mr. Kolga. Do you get the impression that different regimes are more and more aggressive in targeting political parties, depending on how they're funded from one country to the next? Have you seen in your work political regimes, whether it be Russia or China or Iran, target different political parties around the world to try to achieve their goals by getting them on their side, either through money or through ideology?
Thank you for the question. I think it varies by region. I mean, I think in Europe, we have seen Russia fund far-right parties like the AfD. In many countries in Central and Eastern Europe, we've seen them do that. And, I mean, this is very well documented. Those influence operations are very well documented. I think in Canada, what China tries to do is exploit its diaspora, and it has been doing this, I would say, rather effectively over the past 30, even 40 years. I happen to live in Markham Unionville, and I think that the issues in that riding are very well documented as well. But even though, these issues are brought up publicly in committees like this one, I think one bright light in terms of foreign interference was the task force's exposure of the campaign against Joe Tay, the bounty that was placed on him in Markham Unionville. And this is something that we should learn from. CITE's courage, its confidence in calling out those sorts of operations was very effective. I would argue that it probably put largely an end to those sorts of operations and probably made the Chinese government think twice about this. But they will continue on in terms of transnational repression, their efforts to influence Western governments, and certainly I think our government and its diaspora as well. It's only until we stand up to it and impose a cost for these sorts of operations that we will see them stop. And we've seen some European governments do this. Estonia has done this very effectively. We need to do the same.
Thank you. On behalf of the subcommittee, myself, all the members, we would like to thank our witnesses. Thank you for being for us here. Thanks for your introduction, intervention, answering questions, enlightening our subcommittee here. So thank you for your testimony during our meeting for the world repercussion of the transnational repression. I wish you, me and my colleague, the best. Thanks again. And meeting is suspension.